Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Organisational Behaviour, Buzzy 1029. In this video, we're going to talk about leadership and the role of leadership in organisations. We've already talked about organisations through the goal model as being hierarchies, as organisations being social units in which some people do what other people tell them to do. And we've talked in our class on power, about how power allows us to think about the differentials, the power differentials between those who have authority and who can control some people and those who have to do what they're told. In this session, we're going to think a little bit more about the roles and the types of people who enact power, who have power in organisations. And the common term for this, of course, is leadership. So by the end of this session, you should be able to define leadership. We're going to think about some different perspectives on leadership, and we're going to focus in on what's known as trait approaches to leadership, what's sometimes called contingency approaches to leadership or situational leadership, and transformational leadership. And then finally, we're going to think about some of the critical issues with contemporary leadership. If you want to read into this topic, the core reading is Huxinski and Buchanan, chapter 21 in the 6th edition and 18 in the 9th edition. So let's get going. What is leadership? What are we talking about when we talk about leadership? Well, a basic definition we can offer is that leadership is the process of influencing the activities of an organised group in its efforts towards goal setting and goal achievement. So leaders help shape what groups should do. They help to set their goals. We talked about this when we talked about the goal model of organisations. One way of thinking about organisational goals is to go and ask the leaders, what are they trying to do? So that's one element of leadership. But leadership also involves influencing members of organisations in how they achieve those goals. Not just telling them what we're trying to achieve, but also how to achieve it, how to work together, when to do things, what to do. So there's a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about leadership. Sometimes people distinguish between processual, contextual and evaluative views. We're not going to focus on that in this course, but we'll just quickly mention it. So one way of thinking about leadership is that it's an interpersonal process. So leadership is something that leaders do. This is sometimes known as the process view. It focuses on leadership as the leadership process, the thing that leaders do. So if you want to know what leadership involves, go and watch people in leadership positions in organisations and you'll see leadership. The contextual view thinks about leaders in relationship to followers. So it tells us you can't just go and look at what the people who are called leaders do. You have to actually understand, are they actually leading? Are they actually influencing the activities of an organised group? Do they have followers? And in some of the recent literature over the last couple of decades, this has led to a focus on what's known as followership. The evaluative perspective thinks about how effective leadership works. So it's not just focusing on what leaders do or the presence of followers, but thinking about what styles, what types of leadership are actually most effective in achieving organisations' goals. But generally, when we're defining leadership for the purpose of this course, we're going to think about it in terms of influencing others, having power over others. So what kinds of things do leaders do? Well, they set the goals, right? We can call this agenda setting or the creation of agendas. They develop people. They communicate those goals in strategies and visions. They create teams. They put the right people into the right roles. They select the people that can enter into an organisation. They then support execution, so they motivate and energise teams. In fact, I'm going to put that word in there because it's such a good one, motivate. And energise teams and support them in actually doing what they need to do. They give them feedback, so they're going to identify whether work has been done correctly, assign rewards, offer feedback, and highlight when change needs to occur. So when we're saying that leadership is the process of influencing activities, it's a process of influencing activities by creating an agenda, developing people, supporting execution, and evaluating outcomes. And that needs to be a 4, not a 3. Mintzberg, very famous management theorist, tried to formalize this, and he said that there are 10 leadership roles. There are 10 things that leaders tend to do. There are what he calls interpersonal roles, which involve being literally a leader, the person at the front, the figurehead, the liaison between people, the figurehead who speaks on behalf of the organisation to its external environment. There are informational roles. Leaders have to monitor, they have to understand, they have to speak to and speak for. They have to give the right people the right information at the right times. And then there are decisional roles. Leaders often have to make decisions about what an organisation should do. So this involves entrepreneurial behaviour. It involves allocating resources. It involves negotiating. It involves dealing with conflicts and resistance and disturbances. So I'm actually going to put that in here because it relates back to our previous class. Classically, then, when organisation theorists have talked about leadership, they have seen leadership as a quality of the role. That is to say, leadership is a position in the role, structure and division of labour in a particular organisation. Leadership is not, then, something that's possessed by the role holder, the person. And if you think back to our class on power, we talked about some of the different sources of power. Max Weber, who, by the way, is a very influential social theorist of bureaucracy and organisation, he said there is illegitimate forms of power, which are typically not associated with a role in an organisation, but rather an individual. So this might be physical power, or what Weber calls pure power. So you might have the ability to get people, to influence people, not because you have a leadership role, a legitimate leadership role, but just because you threaten them, you coerce them. You might be incredibly charming and manipulative. These are all possessions of the role holder, not the role. So classically, when organisation theorists have thought about leadership, they've tended not to focus on the leaders, but they've tended to focus on the hierarchy or the structure of the organisation, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in the course. From roughly the 1950s onwards, however, for a variety of different social and cultural reasons, organisation theorists increasingly started to focus on the leader, not the leadership role, but the individual leader. And in part, this has, I think, really been driven by a need to help advise and consult actual leaders on what they're doing. And, typically to offer meaningful advice to somebody, you don't want to say, well, it doesn't matter what you do, it's all about the role system and the division of labour. That's not going to be very compelling to managers and leaders of captains of industry. So instead there's been a focus on the leader themselves. So we're going to think about some of the different perspectives which have developed in the literature, but just before we do, let's go back to our learning objectives. So we have now defined leadership. We've thought about leadership as the practice of influencing people's activities. We've thought about some of the typical roles or activities, I should say, that leaders engage in. And we've thought about how classically that's been assigned to a position within an organisational hierarchy, not individual leaders. How we said that changed. Alan Bryman, who is both unfortunately he's passed away recently, but was my friend and my examiner for my thesis, and also somebody that lived in West Bridgford, interestingly enough. Alan Bryman brought together a range of different research traditions on leadership, and he said that there is essentially 6 views on leadership, which he called trait spotting, style counselling, context fitting, new leadership, distributive leadership, and critical leadership. So if you look at the leadership literature, there's leadership which focuses on the personality traits of effective leaders. He called this trait spotting. There's research which looks at the different characteristics of effective leaders, the different ways that they behave, so the style of their leadership. He called this style counselling. He says there's context fitting, which looks at the kinds of situations in which particular styles of leadership or particular types of leaders are most effective. This is context fitting. He said the literature talks about new leadership styles, so we particularly see discussions around heroic, transformational and inspirational leaders. calls this new leadership literature. Then there's literature on distributive leadership, which emphasises that leadership behaviours are needed among followers and subordinates, not just leaders themselves. This is often associated with what's called decentered or decentralised decision making. And then finally, there's literature on critical leadership, which questions whether a lot of these previous approaches are actually the most appropriate for society. Girls. Yeah, girls. I need to do my work. I've got to do some recording. Okay? So you can't just come in. You've got to give me a few minutes. It's okay. You didn't know, but... And it's not your fault that the toilet's not working. Can you... Lana, if you just tell Mummy that I'm doing my recording and to message me if anybody needs to come up on the phone. Thank you.